The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Almighty God, we thank you for the beauty of your creation and all of its diversity. We thank you for making each and every one of us in the imago Dei, the image of God, which means that we can see you in each one of us. Come and be with us today as we carry on our conversation about challenging matters. Inspire our hearts and our ears and our lips that your truth might be spoken and heard. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, good morning. We are carrying on our commemoration of the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's martyrdom. I'll take a moment just to introduce briefly our speaker for next week is Dr. John Backey, who was a professor of communications at the University of Memphis and has written about the public addresses going on and the way that communications were done around the strike. And he'll be speaking to us next week. So, Dr. Backey, thank you so much for being here with us. Yes, indeed. Thank you, Pat. This week is me, and there is a very intentional reason that I chose to speak in this series of events. It's so easy for us to speak about questions of race and history around race as being separate from ourselves, something other, something that someone else was involved with. And what I want to encourage us all to is that we have a story to tell. Each one of us has a story to tell from where we came from and what our experiences have been. And each of our stories is unique. Today I'm going to share with you my story, and it's not for better or worse, it's just mine. I grew up in a different place and with different experiences, and I'm going to share those. I've been in Memphis 4.5 years, and I'll share a little bit of that experience. My purpose is not to prove anything, to disprove anything, to set anything above anything else, but to set a model for how we can tell our own stories, whatever those stories might be. I'm going to begin with just a quick note. I really don't like talking about race. I find it uncomfortable. I don't like to acknowledge that some physical characteristic could have the impact that it seems to have around us in so many ways. I prefer to think that we live in what some have called the post-racial society. Yet, despite my preferences, race remains a really important conversation for us to have, and particularly now. I want to contend that race is a particularly important conversation for people of faith to have. I said in the opening prayer that God has made us in the imago Dei, the image of God, which means that when you look at someone, when you look at anyone, you're seeing a reflection of the divine. You're seeing God in the mirror. Biblical love is not some fuzzy emotion. Biblical love is a dogged act of will. I choose to love you. I insist that I love you. I will find a way to love you. That's what we mean when we talk about love in Scripture and when we talk about love within the Christian community and love for all of God's people. As Christians, one of our fundamental beliefs is that restoration and healing are not only possible, but they are God's deepest desire for us. And one of the other things that we know is that telling the truth as we know it is an important part of that healing and reconciliation. Ephesians 4, speaking the truth in love, we must grow up in every way into Him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by every ligament with which it is equipped, as each part is working properly, promotes the body's growth in building itself up in love. None of what I'm about to say today derives from any curriculum or published material. The class is entirely different from every other class that I have ever given. If that makes you uncomfortable, please come back. If it makes you uncomfortable, good. I was once told that the job of the priest is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable, and we may be doing a little bit of that today. Your story and your truth will be different from the story and the truth that I share today, neither better nor worse, just different. And I hope that this will be a model for how you could tell your story as well. I'm going to introduce a method that I have thrown together and probably has a lot of room for improvement about how we can do this truth-telling about race. The first step is to learn. and to learn with an open mind. Go back and consider your memories of race. When was your first experience of race that you remember? What was that conversation? Who were the people who were growing up around you, and what did that look like? And then go back and check the facts, because sometimes our memories don't quite record things exactly correct. Are there ways that what you remember might not be accurate? Are there ways that you might need to amend the story? Ask whether your memories compare with objective facts. Some will, and some won't. The second is to listen, and to listen with open ears. Not listen from a defensive standpoint of, I might be embarrassed by this, it might be uncomfortable what I'm about to hear, but listen from an open standpoint to say, the person with whom I am speaking has a story and a truth just the same as I do, and I will be richer for having heard their experience. And then the third is to share. What is your experience? So often I talk to folks who will say, well, no, my story, I didn't have that suffering. I didn't have that experience, or their experience was worse than mine, or mine would diminish theirs in some way. That's not true. Your story is your story. And when we go back and put judgments on that, judging our own story as being too good or too bad or too privileged or too underprivileged, we're diminishing that story. And the truth is all of it together. Different stories, different people, one whole truth. My purpose in developing this model is to offer my own reflections today and to demonstrate that it's possible for you to do the same in a way that's safe and non-threatening. So, let me take you home with me for a bit. Somebody asked me the other day if I grew up in Memphis, and I said, no, just a little north of here. And they said, oh, thank you, that's fine. We moved on, just a little bit north. This is the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which I call home. And we're going to talk a little bit about your impressions of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But many people will think that Massachusetts is a very urban and metropolitan place. There is one city in Massachusetts that is urban and metropolitan, and it has a whole bunch of little towns and communities around it that are urban and metropolitan, and then it has a whole bunch of us who live out in the apple orchards to the west. For hundreds of years, literally for hundreds of years, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the colony of Massachusetts, has been two different places joined together. Historically, there was an unspoken deal between the people who lived in the east and who were traders and shippers and people of commerce, and the people who lived in the west, who were farmers in these small towns. And the deal was this: we in the west will elect to government you in the east, as long as you in the east leave us alone. We're fine. We can figure this out. We can gather together. We can make our decisions. We can pay our bills. We do not need your help. We do not need your regulation. Please leave us alone. And for a good solid 200 years in Massachusetts, that deal held and was fine. It was a classic conservative model of limited government, limited regulation, independent communities making decisions for themselves. Because of that, we got what I'm going to refer to as a hyper-local form of democracy. I would contend, let me start here. There are two types of municipalities in Massachusetts: cities, which are governed by a mayor and council, and towns, which are governed by a town meeting. The town meeting works like this. Every year, the town leaders will publish a list of the issues that need to be decided. And if you're a registered voter, you come on down to the high school at the appointed time, and you sit in the auditorium, and the moderator, the town moderator, will say, we're now going to discuss this issue, and if you have a point to make, you stand up and you make your point. And then someone else will stand up and make his or her point. And that will go on for some time, hours and hours, sometimes days. And then the moderator will say, well, here's the question. Who's in favor and who's opposed? And you all raise your hands. And that's how we make decisions in small towns in Massachusetts. Even to this day, the general laws of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts require towns to be governed in that way unless they have a waiver based on their size. This is my little town, Northborough, Massachusetts. It may look like it's sitting on that line between the east and the west, but let me assure you we are in the west. Our little town was incorporated 10 years before the Declaration of Independence. We're very proud of that. Very little history has taken place in our town, but we want to lay claim to it anyway. The legend has it that the Minutemen from Northborough, Massachusetts went to Lexington and Concord. It was a good 40 miles away, so we got there a little bit late, but we were there. The battle was done, but we stood there, and we were there. These are my people. There is a stone in the middle of the town marking the place where General Henry Knox passed by with cannons from Fort Ticonderoga on his way for General George Washington in Boston in the Battle of Bunker Hill. We have no evidence that General George Washington ever came through or that General Knox ever stopped, but he passed through and we put up a stone. My small New England town has 2 family-run apple orchards and another small family farm. And according to the 2000 census, we were a population of 14,006 people, meeting together, making our decisions together, and not really seeing a whole lot of need for all those people in Boston. This was where I was raised. This is my background. It's who I am. The racial demographic of my town broke down like this. We were 93% white. We were 0.6% black or African American, and I'm using that word because that's the census's word. We were 5.1% Asian, which includes all of the countries on the Asian continent, so China and Japan and India and Bangladesh and Pakistan, that whole continent. Russia is considered an Asian country. So we were at 5.1% Asian, and we were 1.3% other. My first memory of race came in this time, and it was that whiteness was just normal. It was the water that we swam in. It was where we were. My first memory of race came while I was a student at Algonquin Regional High School, and a good friend moved to town, and her name was Meenakshi. Meenakshi was a fellow singer in our high school's chamber choir. She was of Indian descent, and I believe that she was a first or second generation American. The memory that sticks out for me about meeting Meenakshi is not interacting with her, but interacting with another student who asked me what her race was. And I answered the question, and it was obvious. She's an African American. She has dark skin. Why is there a question around this? Was there some latent racism in my heart there? Maybe. Probably not. I think I was a kid raised in a country town with 93% white people around me, and I just didn't know. I hadn't been exposed to that diversity. I hadn't come to appreciate the diversity that exists within the community of people whose skin is darker than my own, and how much beauty there is there. I just didn't know. At the time, as I said, only 1.8 of my little town's population was of Indian ancestry. So if you lined up 100 Northborough residents, fewer than 2 of them were from India. 0.6% were African American. I just clumped them together in my mind, and it's taken me a while to sort of spread that out a little bit. Virtually all of my friends to that point in my life had white skin, and I had yet to discover just how much diversity there was. It's been said that a fish cannot describe its own water, and I think that's probably right. The water is the fish's entire reality. It's all that it knows, and that's what I knew. I knew nothing other than the water of Northborough, Massachusetts, and I still had a lot to learn. I'd read about slavery in my textbooks at Algonquin Regional High School. We had watched film strips. We were still doing film strips from the civil rights movement. But I had never traveled to any of the states, much less any of the sites where those events had taken place. I had never met anyone with a living memory of any of those events. To me, conversations about racism and integration and reconciliation and reparations were entirely theoretical, entirely other, entirely apart from my own experience. Race was someone else's problem. I want to just take a brief pause from my notes and say that one of the things that struck me when I came to Holy Communion was being in this room and probably in this setup, and I can't remember what it was that we were discussing, but somebody was sitting here and made reference to remembering the tanks rolling down Walnut Grove in the late 60s. And it was shocking to me that I was sitting in front of somebody who remembered that physically, who saw it with his or her own eyes. That was new for me. I have a suspicion that the water that you swim in here in Memphis, particularly for those of you who have been here for generations, probably has a different understanding of what normal is than what I experienced. And it's good for us to parse that out a little bit and just to tell those stories and to give room for them. So what I have just told you is my experience of Massachusetts as I remember it, with a little bit of help from the census. Race was someone else's problem. It was other from me. When I went to college, I was so proud of my small town heritage that I devoted my senior honors thesis to writing about those little town governments that I just told you about. Why do we need Republican government? And by that I mean little r, not big R. Why do we need the place where we would elect people to make decisions for us? Let's all just get in a room, we'll talk it out, we'll raise our hands. And one of the things I loved most was if you really want the school to be renovated and you want the town to agree to incur debt, you go and get your people and you bring them in and you set up your section. And if you really don't want the town to incur that debt and don't want them to raise the taxes, that's great. You get your people and you bring them in and you sit them down. And then we're going to talk and we're going to vote. And then we're going to go home. And that's how we made decisions. So I spent my senior year studying this and the history of it. And in the process of studying that, the question of race started hitting home for me in new ways that I had not expected. Let's talk a little bit about Massachusetts. When you look at an electoral map of the United States, what color do you expect Massachusetts to be? Blue, right? Massachusetts has always been a blue, far left, liberal-leaning state, right? Wrong. That is incorrect. Incorrect. The modern Republican Party, as we know it, came on the scene in the election of 1856. From 1856 to 1924, there were 18 presidential elections. 17 of them, the Republicans carried Massachusetts. 17 out of 18 elections, the Republican Party, as we know it, carried the Commonwealth of Massachusetts between 1856 and 1924. From 1928 until 2016, there have been 23 presidential elections, and the Democrats have taken 19 of them. We had a complete political realignment of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the 1920s. A complete political realignment. If anybody is interested, the two Republicans who have won the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the second half of the second part of our slide were Dwight Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan. They both won both times, and nobody else has. In 1972, Massachusetts was the only state who did not vote for Richard Nixon, prompting the electoral map with the little blue Massachusetts. 1972, we knew. So I started studying this, and I started learning about this and saying, wow, my understanding of my home state is not entirely accurate when you look at the historical record, which prompts an obvious question. What happened? What happened between 1924 and 1928 that so significantly and so permanently switched the balance? At the same time, I was studying local government and saw that there was a movement away from that what we call open town meeting that I described before to what people called a representative town meeting. So no longer is it everybody in the town comes in and sits down and discusses and votes. Now it's your neighborhood is going to elect some people to go to the town meeting on your behalf, and your neighborhood is going to elect some people to go to town meeting on your behalf, and your neighborhood is going to elect some people, and those representatives are going to come together and make decisions. Now, this didn't make sense to me. And it didn't make sense for one reason. I would understand why big cities like Boston and Worcester and Springfield and Fall River would need to have representative government. They had tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. It's not practical to put them all in a room. We need some sort of system there. Memphis would not operate well if we just put everybody in a room and said, what do you think we should do? So I understood why those cities needed representation, but I didn't understand why a small town would make that move. If you weren't ready to be governed by a mayor and a council, why would you give up that open sense of democracy? And why was it happening in the late 19-teens and the early 1920s at the same time that there was a political realignment? And the answer became clear. I remember sitting in my study carrel on the third floor of the Burke Library at Hamilton College when I realized what had happened. Immigration had happened. Immigrants from Ireland and Italy had been flowing into the United States, and particularly into the northeastern United States, since the late 1800s. And when we got into the 19-teens and the 1920s, they started establishing a critical mass. The demographics of the population began to tilt. These immigrants were largely poor. They were planting down in tenement houses in Boston and the urban city core. But as they started to grow, they started to demand social services. They were poor. They needed social services. They started pushing for them. They started saying, wow, our tenement here is awfully full. Let's see if we can't expand out this way just a little bit. But as so often happens, there were already people living there, right? And so you watch the Boston establishment move from the core of the city out so the immigrants can have it. And then you watch the immigrants start to expand and you see the Boston elite move out further. And they got out about as far as they wanted to go. And then they introduced this concept of representative government. You, ethnic enclave in the side of my town, can elect some representatives. And we white people in the rest of the town will elect our representatives. And it may just be that those boundaries are drawn geographically rather than demographically. And so if you are in a high population density place, you'll get the same number of votes as those of us in a similar region with lower population density. The town of Brookline, Massachusetts, was the first to make the move. They had a neighborhood on the edge of their town called Buttonville, which was named for the brass buttons on fire coats and police coats, because that's where the ethnic people were living, and those were the sorts of jobs that they had. And they started to move to representative government. That town still observes representative government to this day, I might add. There were bosses in Boston, just like there were in Memphis. The most notable boss was Honey Fitzgerald, who was the grandfather of President John Kennedy, and they started rallying people together and saying, you know, we can vote here, and we can influence, and we can do these things. And that started to shift the balance even more. The old arrangement between the city's elite and the countryside's yeomen began to dissolve. No longer was it okay for the state government just to leave alone the people in the West. Now we needed social services, we needed taxation, we needed regulation, we had more people to manage, all of these things. And as the balance tipped, so turned the Commonwealth. At the same time that the American South was implementing Jim Crow, New England patricians like Prescott Hall and Alfred DuPont Chandler were designing a system of laws to disadvantage immigrants. These policies were summed up in a single phrase: no Irish need apply. Italians fared no better. As one person at the time said, we came expecting to find the streets paved with gold. Instead, we found that they were not paved at all, and in fact, that we were expected to pave them. Sitting in that quiet study carrel on the third floor of Burke Library at Hamilton College, application packets available in the narthex, as always. I'm going to get somebody there. One person before I finish at Holy Communion. I realized in that quiet study carrel at Hamilton College that my own grandmother was a part of this. And it all started to get a lot more personal then. These are my grandparents. Many of you know that I absolutely love and adore my grandfather, now 99 years old. On the other side of the image is my grandmother, who died in 2014. Luella Boyle was the oldest of 9 children in a Boston Irish family. She was born in Boston in 1915, and she ultimately gave birth to her own daughter in the town of Brookline, a Tony elite suburb, the first one to move to representative government. The Irish need not apply sign that I found to show you was printed in 1915, the same year that Grandma was born in the city of Boston. It got personal then, in a way that it wasn't personal before. No longer was race someone else's problem. No longer was race a theoretical concept. Race was used as the defining characteristic to keep my grandmother and her family in their working class station, in their Irish neighborhood, so as not to threaten the privileges of those whose ancestors had fled from Europe first. I came away from my thesis project with a more nuanced understanding of the place that raised me. I learned a part of my region's history that is not taught in schools, even to this day, and that I wish had not been true. There's nothing that I can do to change the past or to make up for what was, but there are things that I can do to change the future, and I think they start with telling the truth. A few weeks ago, Jessica and I were listening to National Public Radio, and there was an interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's a correspondent for The Atlantic. He recently wrote a book about racial reparations, and he offers this interesting definition of reparations. He puts it not in terms of money, but in terms of truth. Reparations is the full acceptance, he writes, of our collective biography and its consequence. Reparations is the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequence. It is the price that we must pay to see ourselves squarely. Reparations beckon us to reject the intoxication of hubris and see America as it really is, the work of infallible people. He goes on in an interview with Krista Tippett to say that we can't have a la carte patriotism. If we're going to claim a whole American heritage, we need to claim the whole American heritage. He says, you cook out on the 4th of July, but many of your ancestors weren't here. They played no role in that. They had nothing to do with it. Either you're in or you're out. Either you're a part of it or you're not. I found that so convicting. How do we hold on to the parts of our past that we're so proud of and honor them and lift them up and make sure that we teach them to our children? And how do we also go and say, and these are the places where we didn't get it right? I'm not a parent, but I have to say in my interactions with my parents, the times when they have said, I didn't get it right, has been so instructive and so helpful. Rather than seeing them as perfect, we got it right the first time every time, it gave me a chance to say, wow, they struggle with it too. And now as an adult, having to make my own choices, to know that I'm not going to always get it right and that things are going to be okay even when I don't. I moved south just after college. Anybody want to chuckle at that? I thought it said New York up there. I'm sorry. This is in Manhattan. I moved south after college, thought it would be the furthest south that I would ever live. Didn't know about you all then. Actually, it was in those years that I made my first trip to Memphis, staffing a meeting for the National Church. This is the front door of our denominational headquarters on 2nd Avenue. Came to Memphis, stayed at the Fogelman Center at the University of Memphis, and was taken for drinks at Reynolds and Stephanie Cheney's house, which I thought was just fantastic. So I moved south to Manhattan, a kid wanting to be a priest. I'd been passed over for the priesthood the first time around, and I was trying to stay as close to it as possible, thinking that I might have something to offer. Went to New York, got a job working on the national staff, and was just living the life. I had an apartment in Jersey City. I commuted on the PATH train. I had a subway card. I had the whole thing. I had my bagel place that I would go. It was awesome. And one day, I was living the dream and riding in an elevator at 815 2nd Avenue, and one of my colleagues from the finance department got on the elevator, and we chit-chatted a little bit and went on with our day. A little bit later in the afternoon, she calls me and says, will you come and meet with me, please? And I had picked a conference room where we were to meet. And so I said yes and went down. And in that, she said, on the elevator, you said this, and I took that, and I was deeply offended by that. The words that I had used were not the sort of big red-letter words that we don't use in polite conversation. It was a side comment of some sort. I had meant nothing by it, but she was offended by it, and offended enough that she came back to it later in the day, and offended enough that she found the courage to call me, find a neutral space, and tell me that what I had said had offended her. I don't remember what the comment was. all of these years later. But what I learned in the experience was that offense is not in the eyes of the speaker, but in the eyes of the hearer. And if we're going to engage in relationship with people where we honor the imago Dei, the image of God, that reflection of God that we see coming back in everybody's eyes, we have to give people room to be offended, even if we didn't mean it. I am so grateful to this person who still works up there, and I still see her every 3 years at the General Convention, and I always go up and give her a big hug, and I'm so grateful for it because she gave me a chance to know that I hadn't been perfect, gave me a specific instance to look back on, and gave me room to apologize and to seek to do it differently. I tell that story a lot when in sexual misconduct prevention training, those of you who've done that class with me, because one of the things they tell us is that when you see something concerning, just go talk to the person. 99 times out of 100, something's not wrong, and it gives them an opportunity to change course and do things differently. And then in that 1% of cases where something is wrong, it tells them that you're watching. This was one of the 99%. I hadn't meant anything. I was 23 years old. I didn't know many African American people. And I said something that wasn't okay. And I remain grateful to this day, 15 years later, that she told me. Then I really came south. Remember at the beginning, I told you that I do not like talking about race. I was hoping to live a priesthood that didn't make me talk about race or human sexuality. It's not working out very well on those counts. When I moved to Memphis, questions about race became inescapable. Racial inequalities in employment, education, imprisonment are the water that we swim in here, and particularly so in this 50th anniversary year of Dr. King's martyrdom. I remember sitting in a listening session, I can't remember whose house we were in, but in all those cottage meetings that we were doing and then redid, and was talking to somebody and said, well, I think we can make a real difference in race in Memphis. And one of our older members said, Sandy, we have tried. We have given money, we have gone to the things, we have hired the people, we have tried. And there was this sense of, we tried, it didn't work, and it's not going to change. And I think that was so honest. And I was so grateful to that person for being so honest. Because if that's what's really in our hearts, we're going to have a problem as we try to address some of this. And probably what we need to overcome the most are these questions of, we have tried, it didn't work, or it got better, but not enough, and now we have to try again. And we just have to keep trying. As the conversation about Confederate statues started being debated in the news a few months ago, I went to visit General Forrest on Union Avenue. I'd driven past him before, but I wanted to study it this time. I wanted to see it for myself. The poem inscribed on the pedestal reads, "He fought like a Titan and struck like a god, and his dust is the ashes of our glory." I wanted to see that. I wanted to see other important phrases like erected by his countrymen and in honor of his military genius. I wanted to see for myself what all the fuss was about. As I looked and as I read the inscriptions, an African-American gentleman in a very well-cut suit came up behind me, then another and another. By chance, I had stumbled into a press conference of clergy advocating for the statue's removal. You can't make this stuff up. I stepped off the platform so that their program could proceed, thinking to myself that they needed room to tell their truth and they didn't need me getting there. They had made a plan. But I wanted to hear what they said. So I went and stood with the reporters, and I was dressed like this because I was coming from a meeting or something. Stood with the reporters to hear what they had to say. Just before the meeting began, the first man that I met called out to me and to another pastor who was standing next to me, and he said, "If you gentlemen would like to reconsider, you're welcome to stand with us." I will never forget those words. If you gentlemen would like to reconsider, you're welcome to stand with us. In an instant, my heart was transported back to the 1960s, when clergy were categorized by their stance on racial integration. In 1963, Episcopalians in Alabama were among the clergy that asked Dr. King to give integration more time, prompting his masterful letter from Birmingham jail. In 1964, leaders from Second Presbyterian Church in Memphis blocked African American students from entering their building for worship. In 1968, some leaders from the so-called white church joined Dr. King and subsequently Mrs. King in their marches downtown. Others did not. If you gentlemen would like to reconsider, you're welcome to stand with us. I reconsidered. The removal of Confederate statues were not my issue when I came to Memphis. I didn't care for them. I wouldn't have put them up, but they didn't trouble me. I enjoyed learning about some of the past of this place. I needed my African American friends to help me realize the problem. As before, offense is not determined by the one who speaks, but by the one who hears. My assessment of the situation was less important than theirs. Not long after this experience, I found myself as part of Mayor Strickland's clergy delegation to the Tennessee Historical Commission when he presented the first or second or third petition for permission to remove the statues. Many of my traveling companions had been fighting for racial justice in Memphis longer than I have been alive. They'd been disappointed before, and at that meeting, they were disappointed again. One of my traveling companions was Dr. James Netters, now 90 years old. Dr. Netters had a seat on the platform for the March on Washington, and he heard Mahalia Jackson change the history of American rhetoric when she called out to Dr. King, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." Dr. Netters was a leader in the effort to desegregate public transportation in Memphis. He became the first African American to sit on the city council, and he was beaten by the Memphis police while he was serving in public office. Someone asked Dr. Netters why he kept fighting after he'd done so much, why he traveled all that way at his advanced age. He responded in a simple and deeply profound way, citing a hymn. "If I can help somebody as I pass along, then my living shall not be in vain." Dr. King said in his final sermon, "It's all right for preachers to talk about the New Jerusalem, but one day God's preacher must talk about the new New York, the new Atlanta, the new Philadelphia, the new Los Angeles, the new Memphis, Tennessee." It seems to me that the new Memphis begins with a lot of listening and a lot of sharing. You've been kind to listen to my truth, and I hope that it will inspire you to share a bit of your truth. Just for the record, I remain incredibly proud of my New England heritage, as most of you know. But I tell my stories differently now. It doesn't make me ashamed of where I come from. It doesn't change my perspective. Well, it does change my perspective. It just lets me tell the story in a different way. I've studied my stories with a more critical eye. I remain very proud of the work I did as a 22, 23, and 24-year-old in New York City. But I also remember that it wasn't perfect. I remain very proud of Memphis and of the good work that we're doing here. And I'm reminded that our work is not yet complete. So what's next? What's the point of all this sharing? A number of you have been asking me lately, as we've been saying, what are we going to do about race relations in Memphis? You've been saying, well, what practically are we going to do? What practically? We're not going to just talk and theorize and have a series of forums and all that. What are we going to do practically? What I'm going to offer is that this is a practical model. This is something that each and every one of us can do. Take an hour, 2 hours, write down those original memories of race, and then go back and check them. Census data is online, you can find that easily. Go back and find newspaper reports and other things that would give you a perspective that was written down then, one of those little time capsules, and see if you need to amend the story a little bit. Tell it in a different way. Then listen. You'll notice that I put listen ahead of share. The learning gives us the sort of critical analysis. It gives us the perspective that we need. But then we need to listen to somebody else before we presume to share ours. It's about bearing witness. I've been talking to folks lately about pastoral care and how is it that clergy provide pastoral care and what is the nature of pastoral care. Pastoral care is bearing witness to truth. That's all it is. You have cancer, you have whatever, something is happening in your life. Somebody's going to come and bear witness to that truth. We're not going to make it any better, but we're going to say you're not alone in it. So it is with sharing, or with listening. Allowing somebody else to share their truth without judgment, without comment, without feedback, and just saying, thank you for sharing your truth. Now may I share with you mine. That's how relationships start. That's how we start to see the imago Dei in other people. There's another practical step that you've heard me talk about lately, and if you haven't, here you get it again. The work of Bridges USA is something with which Holy Communion has partnered for many, many years. Bridges takes youth from different demographics of the city and puts them together in leadership development training that's intentionally cross-racial. Intentionally cross-racial. It forces kids to be in situations that are different from where they are and gives them the safety to experience things and to have conversation together in a monitored, structured way. I would offer to the parents of teenagers the number one practical thing that you can do for race relations in Memphis is to send your kids to Bridges. I'm going to lay it that plain. If you have a teenager in your life, I need you to send them to this program. You have to be nominated into it. The church has nomination packets. Hester or I will be glad to sign those nominations for you. It's one of those practical things that we can do to say leadership development doesn't just have to happen with people that we go to school with. Leadership development should happen with people that we don't. Number one thing we can do for teenagers, in my opinion, in Memphis. And then the other is this. In the wake of the Black Lives Matter protest on the I-40 bridge a couple of years ago, a group of pastors has come together in Memphis. It's a group that is still trying to find out sort of who it is and what it is, but it's beautiful to watch it come together. Rufus Smith at Hope Church, who's one of the most inspiring men I've ever heard speak in my life, is the genesis behind it, and they're doing great work. It's called Memphis Christian Pastors Network. And down this afternoon, today, so if you are inspired to do something today, you can do it. Down at Mississippi Boulevard Christian Church, there's going to be a commemoration of the beginning of the sanitation workers' strike in '68. There's an outdoor drama presentation. I don't know what this is, but I'm looking forward to finding out at 2:30. And then there's worship from 3:30 to 5:30. And I would really encourage anybody who wants just to step out of your comfort zone a little bit to head on down to Mississippi Boulevard this afternoon. It's going to be a safe space. It's going to be people from across Memphis. There will be white folks and black folks and all kinds of other folks. There are going to be poor folks and rich folks. And they're all going to be together remembering the event that started it all in this year and just having time to be together in prayer. I understand there will be food trucks starting at 2. And so it's really just going to be a wonderful time, and I would encourage anybody to go. And I'll leave that slide up for a little while longer. This is what I have for you. It's a model that I think is useful. I then applied the model and told a little bit of my story, and then I've given a few action items that are just small steps that we can take as we move forward. What questions, comments, or feedback are there? I do not remember when Edmund Brooke was elected from Massachusetts. Oh, thank you. So what Daniel's just offered is that Edmund Brooke was the first African American elected to the Senate from Massachusetts, or the whole Senate anywhere? From Massachusetts. And that is a story that I, having grown up in Massachusetts, didn't know. And so I'm grateful to know it. What else? Pat, did you have a question? Or a comment?
You said that you grew up in very small,
There were 14,000 people in my town. This is not Somerville here. You know, it's different.
I was just wondering what time.
Oh, good question. Yeah, so when someone from Massachusetts says they're from a small town, Randy today is in LaGrange, Tennessee. That's a small town. And we weren't that. We weren't that. So a little bit different there, some in between. Pat asked me what the role of the church was in our community. We had a lot of churches for our 14,000 people. We were very well served. Our downtown town square had a big white steepled congregational church with the blue doors on the front. If you go just up Church Street off the town square, there's another one that's currently the Unitarian Church, and they have a bell sitting in the front yard cast in Paul Revere's shop, which is just a wonderful treasure for us. Then there was a small Baptist church, a small Episcopal church, 2 Roman Catholic churches, Trinity, UCC, Nativity, probably 6 or 7 churches serving 14,000 people. It wasn't, church was just sort of what you did. Not unlike here, where it's just what you do on Sunday, and you all had your little base, and you had your youth group, and that was your team. And my team was a little white A-frame, pine-lined Episcopal church out on Howard Street, 45 Howard Street, directly across the street from the cemetery. The rectory, which was my first home, was between the church and the cemetery, between the living and the dead. That's where we lived. And I just thought my dream job was going back to lead Church in the Nativity Northborough. I didn't know there was anything else. And that's what I wanted to do. And it's been amazing to see what God had in store for me. Anything else? Questions or comments? Charlton, please.
Well, there's one other and that is Team Read.
Thank you. Tell us about Team Read, please, Charlton.
Well, Team Read is to and learn and share across racial lines.
Thank you, Charlton. And certainly what I put up here was not exhaustive. What Charlton is offering is a program that we volunteer with at Shady Grove Elementary, which is our partner school, and the Emmanuel Center. And it's an opportunity. The reason that it's for second graders is because there's a huge amount of evidence to suggest that reading on grade level at 3rd grade is one of those determinative moments that has huge impacts on outcome. And so the goal is to get children on reading level by the 3rd grade, and we have a lot of people who do that from Holy Communion. Peggy. Bridges. What Peggy and Charlton have just offered is that one of the benefits of the Team Read experience is not just that you're helping a kid get on to grade level reading, but you're developing a relationship with somebody whose experience of life is different than yours in a lot of cases. There aren't a lot of places where I interact with folks from a highly different socioeconomic strata. And so being intentional about how do I create those relationships, how do I have meaningful engagement, how do I see the face of God in those people is very important. What Barbara has just offered for those who couldn't hear is that, in her opinion, what we need to be doing is advocating to the legislature for greater early childhood education across the board. So Joel has asked a question that I am not going to answer, and thank you very much. I'm coming to it. The question is, how much progress do I, Sandy, think that we have made in the last 40 or 50 years? And that's not one that I'm going to answer. Because that's a matter of somebody's truth and experience. It's not an objective question. Can I say, are things different? Yes, absolutely. Are they better? Probably, but I would need to ask somebody who's been here a long time, and I'd want to ask a couple of people who have been here a long time to say, what is that? What was it like then? What is it like now? What has it been for families over generations who have seen this? And I don't have that knowledge to answer that question. Well, I think what I'd encourage you to is to find ways to ask that question. What I'd encourage you to is to find ways to ask your question of a number of people in different life experiences and see what they have to say. Other questions or comments, feedback?
I love that sort of message.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. I think a good question for all of us to be asking when it comes to learning about our story, sharing our story, is what is it that we're afraid of? What is it that makes that vulnerability so scary? And if we can name that, one of the skills we use in pastoral care a lot is naming fears, because to name something is to have power over it. That's a very biblical concept. God brought all of the animals to Adam, and Adam named them. And what Adam called them is what they're called. Adam had power over them. Adam gave them a name. And if we can do the same thing and say, what I'm afraid of is this, we can name it, we can label it, and we can honor it as we proceed anyway. And that's what I'd encourage a lot of folks to. If you say, well, I'm uncomfortable, I don't want to go there. Why? Why don't we want to go there? And how might we be able to, even though it's uncomfortable? Thank you, Steve. Mm-hmm. So you've seen social interactions in Memphis change considerably in the last 50 years. Is that right, Peggy? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. For those who couldn't hear in the back, what Catherine was offering are two books that she's recently read. One is Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, and the other is Evicted, which gives a perspective on poverty and a number of different elements. Lauren? Dinosaurs were roaming the earth and all. Yeah. Well, Lauren was just sharing that he was in conversation as a child with an African-American young man, and that child said, "You're going to spend the rest of your life putting down people like me." And all these years later, that phrase has stuck with him. For me, that phrase was that question about whether Meenakshi was an African-American or not. I don't know why that stuck. I guarantee whoever asked me that question isn't thinking about it today. But those little things just stick. Sorry? You did say it, yes, yeah. So those little things just stick with us, and what I'd encourage you to is to go back to that space. This has been a great conversation. Phil, I'll give you last word. I don't often give away the last word, so you'll see if I take it back. Yeah, thank you, Phil. John, I'm going to ask you if you would give us just a 2-second preview of next week. What can we expect?
Originally by Benjamin about the series, we talked about the different things, at different programs. And one of the programs we thought we ought to look at was, in a sense, why people were not surprised when Martin Luther King was killed here. Why so many people really were shocked because they weren't shocked. Or in other words, how did the city get to the point where we actually felt that way? So we had one program here about the start of the strike, another about the commemoration of the strike, today's program about race. And so I thought somebody ought to talk about how we got to the point where we were so polarized that people were actually recognized that something terrible had to happen before the strike could end. And that was true. Something terrible did have to happen. It didn't necessarily have to be the assassination of King. It could have been the assassination of Mayor Loeb. It could have been a riot much greater than the riots that did occur. But we were to the point where before people could get, the leadership could get back to reason, something awful had to happen. Those of you who remember those days remember the tension that was everywhere. And we recently had a controversy over statues. Sorry. Nothing compared to the kind of atmosphere that was in this city on April 4th of 1968. My wife Becky and I had just come to Memphis in 1967. I originally we both grew up in Iowa, spent some time in New York. I was from a large city in Iowa, 3,000. Becky was
from a booming metropolis by those standards.
Becky was from a small one, 625. But our ethnicity was this way. In my little town of Waukon, Iowa, W-K-O-N, we named after an Indian chief who had the distinction of marching a lot of white people into the Mississippi River. We did not build a statue to him, but we did name our town after him. But our town was diverse. We had about a third Irish, about a third Norwegian. I was one of those, Baki. A third German, and the rest were something else. A few Indian Native Americans and a few Swedes, but that was it. And so when I came to Memphis, I came with eyes about as open and as mind about as naive as Sandy did.
Thank you. So that's up for next week, another reflection from an outsider, though one who's been here for 50 years as opposed to 5. Folks, we need to adjourn because it's time for church, but thank you for a wonderful, wonderful conversation.